Jesus, sing his mercy and his grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, he'll prepare for us a place.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. While we walk the pilgrim pathway, clouds will overspread the sky. But when traveling days are over, not a shadow, not a sign.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. Let us then be true and faithful, trusting, serving every day. Just one glimpse of him in glory will the toils of life repay.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. Onward to the prize before us, soon his beauty will behold. Soon the pearly gates will open, we shall tread the streets of gold.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory.
wonderful story of love,
Tell it to me again.
wonderful story of love,
Wake the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it. Shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love.
wonderful story of love,
Though you are far away,
wonderful story of love,
still he doth call today, calling from Calvary's mountain, down from the crystal bright fountain, e'en from the dawn of creation. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love.
wonderful story of love,
Jesus provides a rest
wonderful story of love,
for all the pure and blessed. Rest in those mansions above us, with those who've gone on before us, singing the rapturous chorus. Wonderful story of love. 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 strong. Jesus, keep me from all wrong.
All right, so we're talking about Genesis. We're talking about Noah's story that I've mentioned before. It goes all the way through the end of Genesis 11. I think we looked at this map at the end of class last time, which is a general map breaking down kind of where these three groups that and you can't even call them groups. That's not even fair, because there's lots of ethnicities that arise from each one of these families. There's lots of nationalities. It's also not clear in this list. Very often scholars call Genesis 10 the Table of Nations, but it's not even clear that these are all nations. Sometimes it seems as if maybe there's personal names being used. However, I would submit to you that more often than not, the ethnicities and the nationalities that arose were connected to those personal names. And so maybe it is a personal name, and maybe there was a real person named that, but the descendants were also called by that name. And the most obvious example of that is Jacob's name is changed to Israel, and the people of Israel arise from that. And so that's what I understand from this, but we got to be careful when we look at lists like this and understand the purpose of them. So we start off, these are the records of the generations of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah, and sons were born to them after the flood. And so we are getting a record of the generations that arose post-flood. And we made mention, I think, last time as well of that passage in Acts 17. I want to say it's in verse 26, where Paul makes reference to, from one man God made every nation of mankind. That has a direct reference back to this chapter. That is what is being demonstrated here, is that all of these nations throughout the world arose from these three men. All right, so verse 2, the sons of Japheth were, now, everywhere we've seen these sons listed, from Genesis 5 to Genesis 8 to right here at the beginning in Genesis 10, what's the order? Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Why does he start with Japheth? Why does he start with Japheth? The assumption would be Shem, Ham, and Japheth would be the order of what? Their birth order. That would be the assumption that everybody makes. So why does he start here with Japheth? And I'll go ahead and tell you, I've looked at this a lot today and looked at a lot of people's suggestions. There are some chronology things that you can pull out of the Bible and actually place some particular births for some of the sons of Noah, but not all of them. We don't actually know necessarily their birth order exactly. We do know that they were not born at the same time. They are not triplets. He started having children at 500, and the flood didn't happen until 600, and it's pretty clear that one of his child were born a lot closer to the flood than 500 when he was 500 years old. So you'll pick that up as you read through this. But what I want us to understand is there's a reason for the order of the listing, and I think there's even a reason for why we start with Japheth here. Now, I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead just a little bit, and let's go back over to verse 21 of this chapter. And we got a good distribution, I think, of different translations that are being used. So this is the way the New American Standard Bible reads. And also to Shem, the father of all the children of Eber, and the older brother of Japheth, children were born. And so that verse makes it clear that Shem was older than Japheth, at least as it is translated there. There is a translation or two out there that actually suggest that it's the other way around. But that's because there is a position that's taken, and then they look at the text and go, well, this allows for that. And that's always a dangerous way to make determinations about stuff like that. So I would suggest to you that the reason they're put in the order they're put in is to draw attention to one of them over the rest. The reason why Shem is listed first in all of the accounts of these are the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth is because Shem is the lineage of Noah that leads to the Messiah. That's the focus. That's the one that matters. I would submit to you that they are given in the opposite order here for the exact same reason. It's working from Japheth toward Shem, and then Shem's lineage is brought back up again in chapter 11. Because that's the one we focus on from this point out. Shem's descendants are the ones that brought Abraham into the world. They brought Isaac, they brought Jacob, they brought Judah, David, Jesus. And so that's the focus. And that is what's going on here is we are being drawn into focusing on Shem. So we start with Japheth and Gomer and Magog and Madai and Javan and Tubal and Meshech and Tyrus. And we go through all these sons and look in verse 5. From these, the coastlands of the nations were separated into their lands, everyone according to his language, according to their families, according to their nations. All right, so here's my first question. If these are three brothers, and these are the sons of these three brothers, what language did Noah speak? Noah language, whatever it was. And what language did he teach his three sons? The same language. And so these three boys that are being talked about who gave rise to all these nations spoke the same language. So here's the question. How do we get to nationalities and languages and families being different? See chapter 11. That's exactly right. We're talking about how we find the world today. How do we find the world that we see today if everybody came from three sons and their three wives? And he's saying, this is how you got it. This is how you got the nations. This is how you got the languages. These people, and they're pictured up here in the red area on this map. These are the people who eventually spread up into Europe and go, by the way, if you over here on where it says Japheth, Caspian Sea is right there. If you keep going off that, where you end up in Russia. Okay. Then he says, the sons of Ham were Cush. This is this area right here. I guess I can pull my thing out and show you. Right here is Cush down here. We have Cush and Mizraim and Put and Canaan. Canaan's right over here. And you see all this area is connected together. This is just a little jump over that little bit of water down there, not a big deal. And so all of these people are the descendants of Ham. And if you keep on going down here, it says Canaan became the father of Sidon in verse 15, the firstborn of Heth, the Jebusite, the Amorite, the Girgashite, the Havite, the Arkite, the Sinite, and the Arvadite, and the Zamorite, and the Hamathite. And afterward, the families of Canaan were spread abroad. And so they all start in this area. Let's see, somewhere right in here is where Ararat would be, if I'm looking at the map right. So we're moving this way, and we're going to look at another map that shows that in just a second. This is going to be the first area that the descendants of Ham are. Then they move over to North Africa. Then they move south, and they move here. And so that's the spread. How many generations did it take? A bunch. This isn't happening in a week or a month or a year. Ham is long dead and gone before any of these nations arise that came from his loins. This is a big picture. This is how we got these people living in this part of the world. I'll draw your attention to verse 10. As we're talking about the sons of Ham, notice right there, and the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. See chapter 11. In fact, at the beginning of chapter 11, who was at Babel? All of these people were at Babel. Okay, so we're gonna see that land continued to be occupied by the descendants of Ham, which I think just goes to show you how obstinate and how much they were fighting against God even from then. Because God is actively trying to disperse them from there in chapter 11, and those are the people that stay. That's what it says there. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. There was a group from those descendants that didn't even leave Babel, that just refused to go anywhere. And that's, I think, telling about their callousness toward God. The other thing I'll mention to you, I think, maybe not. I thought it was in here. I thought I made a note of it, but maybe I did it in another. Oh, here we go. We'll do that when we get to sons of Shem. Okay. There's another little interesting note here that is worth just noticing. All right, so that's where all those descendants went, and all those nations, the Arvadites, the Zemarites, the Archites, the Sinaites, obviously named after Sinai, the Sidonians, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Girgashites, those people's names will come up intermittently as you read through the Old Testament. Usually, they are the peoples who are fighting against Israel. Those are the descendants of Ham, ultimately. And so those are the people who inhabit the land of Canaan specifically, who are the descendants of Canaan specifically, and who are the subject of the curse that's talked about at the end of the previous chapter. All right, the next brother is Shem. We don't talk about the Shemites, although we probably should. Instead, what do we refer to them as? The Semites, the Semitic people, the Israelites, and their other close kin who descended from Shem. We're going to find out who those people are. Also, Shem, the father of all the children of Eber, and the older brother of Japheth. Children were born. The sons of Shem were Elam and Asher, Arpachshad, Lud, and Aram, the Aramites. Those are the kinsmen of the Israelites. Sons of Aram and Uz and Hul and Gether and Mash. Arpachshad became the father of Shelah, and it starts breaking down the next generations and the next generations, and we eventually get down to that's verse 31. Well, let's go to verse 30. Now their settlement extended from Mesha as far as you go towards Sephar, the hill country of the east. These are the sons of Shem, according to their families, according to their languages, by their lands, according to their nations. And so this is all this area. And we're going to find out the modern nations that are in there in just a little bit. But this is the area that is talking about that these people. Now, eventually, the Israelites are carried away into Egyptian bondage, spend 400 years over there, and then they come back and receive this land from God. And so you'll see how close these are, all their kinsmen. And so when they came across the Red Sea and came into this land, They were in the land of their kinsmen. And in fact, there's one point that God chastises one of those nations because they treated them so poorly. And he said, how could you treat your kinsmen that way? And so that's what's going on, and that's how this story unfolds. The interesting verse to me is in verse 25, because there's always this big struggle between human knowledge and divine knowledge. Always a fight, always a struggle. And what does human science suggest explains? Human science acknowledges that we're all connected. Okay, that's the first thing we need to understand. Human science prescribes a migration pattern we're going to look at in just a moment that really isn't all that different than this one. When you get down to it, it's a little bit different, and it's being shifted in modern times. They're wanting more of it to come from Africa now instead of the Middle East, which is what was always agreed was the birthplace of civilization. But anyway, there's some minor changes there, but the general view is that people migrated, and they migrated on foot, and that requires what? It does require time, no doubt about that, but what else does it require? How do you walk across the ocean? You don't walk across the ocean. So there has to be some type of connection. And in fact, one of the theories that you might have heard of is the land bridge theory. When you get way over here off the end of this map and you go through Russia, what happens at the Bering Strait? Right across the water is what? Alaska. And it is theorized that there used to be a land bridge between there, and that's how the people got to North America and then down to South America, because there was a place for them to walk. They didn't have to walk across the sea because there was a land bridge. But even more fundamental than that is another theory that gets thrown around out there that's called continental drift. And they say, hey, look, we're watching these things, and it looks as though even still yet today that the continents are getting slightly further apart from one another than they were in the past. Look at verse 25. The two sons were born to Eber. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided. And his brother's name was Joktan. There are some people who theorize that phrase, in his day the earth actually was the marker of the beginning of continental drift starting to take place. That in fact was part of God's work to separate these peoples and get them where he wants them and isolate them from one another, which is, we're going to find out what his goal was in Genesis chapter 11. So it may reference that. I just thought it was interesting and worth pointing out that there are scholars who say, hey, look, that's suggesting continental drift right there. And possibly it does. And we don't need to fight what can actually be known. We need to fight what people make up. Or actually, the more dangerous thing is when they take a theory and they present it as a fact. That's what we need to call them on. What is factual, we need to not fight. Yes?
The other theory would be that the continents was all one, and then after the flood, that's how you got people in New Guinea who look like people in Africa.
Yep.
I don't have no bridge to get over there.
But what happened is, over time, I would say by the providence of God, peoples were separated. And that is what's being described in chapter 10, is this migration. How they got from this one place and being one people who were one family and all spoke the same language to being all over the world and speaking different languages and being from different nations and having different ethnicities. This is basically in an extremely condensed record saying this is how that happened. How long did it take? I have no idea. I don't know exactly how long it was after the flood before these people were spread throughout the world. I don't think we're supposed to assume just because by the time we get to the end of chapter 10, it says, hey, they covered this coastal area, they covered this people over these, and you have this map right here. Oops, I jumped. Oh, well, I hit it with the wrong pen. But this map works as well. That they all started here as one family, and now what we see is people populating all these different continents and speaking all these different languages and not looking like brothers and sisters. How did that happen? We're learning. We're learning how that happened in these 2 chapters. Yes, sir.
I would say just as far as the languages and timing goes, I mean, obviously there's Babel kind of starts the whole thing. But I mean, even if you compare between English spoken in the United States in 1900
Britain.
versus...
Well, yeah.
Yeah, even like...
Here.
English in the United States versus 1900 versus today, there are lots of significant differences in like 100 years. So the language thing...
Can happen quickly.
A long time, and especially once you're isolated, you know.
What, see, the isolation thing is what's important. Once you separate people and you give them different languages, you create isolation. And once you create isolation, then lots of differences can arise. And so that's part of what we're learning in chapters 10 and 11. I'll go ahead and move through these really quick. This is just a more detailed map of where these people lived, and it goes to a little bit more the Caspian Sea, you know, a little bit about. Here's Babylon over here. We have Nineveh up here. These are cities that we know about. This is Uz. That's a land that's mentioned more than once in the scripture. This is Asia Minor. So the 7 churches of Asia, this is all that area that we find about by New Testament times. This, of course, you recognize as Italy. This is the Aegean Sea over here. This is Europe. This again, going this way is to what we used to call the USSR. Now it's just a whole bunch of little countries that are former Soviet bloc, is the way that we talk about them, because we can't even remember what all their names are, and some of the names change like really quick, and we're like, wait a minute, you've changed your name again? But anyway, this is the largest majority of this. Anybody know what that is? Saudi Arabia. There is a couple other countries around in there. This right up here is modern day Turkey, and we're going to see that in just a second. I think the next map, yeah. This has the overlay of all the modern nations. And so we got Oman down here. We've got Yemen down here. This is Ethiopia over here, the Sudan, Egypt. Come over here. This is Jordan, Iraq, what used to be called Babylon and Assyria. We're talking about Iraq and Iran, and all of those countries are what populate that area today. This is Iran right over here. When you study through the Old Testament, it talks about the Medo-Persian Empire. We're talking about Iran. And the interesting part is, well, here's Nineveh. This is the city of Nineveh that Jonah was sent to. That's in the middle of Iraq, right near Mosul, which you heard about on the news pretty much every night for 10 years when the Iraq War was going on. When they were talking about Mosul, that is essentially the exact same city as Nineveh. We go, Syria's up here, Turkey's up here. This goes over toward Europe over here. Modern Turkmenistan is part of the old Soviet bloc nations. And so going that way leads to the Soviet Union. These nations this is the United Arab Emirates that you hear so much about. This little bitty spot right here is Kuwait. So that is the modern layout of this same land. There are still people living there. They are still the descendants of those three men. So, the Hebrews arose from Shem. More than likely, if we're from Europe, we arose from Japheth. That's the most likely connection. So that's just a little bit to look at and consider about these people. Chapter 11 is the important chapter in my book. Chapter 11 comes in after chapter 10, but it's actually talking about things that took place, I think, early in chapter 10 to give rise to the spread and the nationalities and the ethnicities and the languages that are described there. How did that happen? Well, here you go. The whole earth used the same language and the same words. Well, that makes sense because they were all from the same family. And it came about as they journeyed east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they used brick for stone, and they used tar for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven." By the way, don't think that they were actually trying to get to God. I actually got taught that in Bible class when I was a kid. That is not what they were doing. They were building a tall building. They were building tall walls around their city with tall towers, and all that represents what? Security and safety and power and wealth. They were trying to make the greatest city in the world. By the way, that still goes on to this very day in every country of the world. Everybody tries to make theirs the best and the biggest.
Prior to that, every continent has pyramids. Those were the replicas of the somewhat of the Tower of Babel.
That is
every continent, even in America, we have pyramids. And that was the first skyscrapers, but it was based off a different belief.
I believe that this is a ziggurat.
Yeah. They took that knowledge from Babel, and when they spread it across the land, it was practicing some of the same things.
Yep. It's pretty fascinating, by the way. The ones in South America are actually amazing. Quite amazing. Because they are still, you can't slide a piece of paper between the stones. They're still that tight and right and square all these years later. But anyway, that's what they're doing. They're building this great city. Now, what has God told them to do? Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. They get to a place and say, "Hey, we like it here. Let's build a city and let's stay here," which is the exact opposite of what God said do. So, this is what it says. The Lord came down. By the way, notice it even points it out in quite distinct, clear language, the end of verse 4. "Let us make for ourselves a name, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." That is the very thing they were trying to prevent from happening by building this city. And that is the very thing that God had told them to do. And so they said, "We don't want to go any further. I'm tired of walking, and I like it here." The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. The Lord said, "Behold, they're one people. And they all have the same language." And this is what they began to do. What did they begin to do? Forget God. We're going to make a city for ourselves. We're going to make a name for ourselves, and we're going to stay here. Instead of saying, it's all about God, and He needs to be glorified, and He needs to be listened to, and we need to do what He told us to do, they said, it's about us, and we need to make a name for ourselves and build a city with security for ourselves. We don't need help from God. And we need to prevent ourselves from being scattered everywhere, which is, again, the exact opposite of what God had said that they should do. And so He says, this is what they begin to do. Now, nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them as long as man cooperates and has that absolute communication. Man can do some absolutely amazing things. And if we can achieve amazing things, what do we start thinking? We don't need God. And by the way, that's what proves itself out. The National Academy of Sciences, I just listened to a lecture by Neil deGrasse Taylor today. One of the things that struck him as interesting, the National Academy of Sciences, which are all the most brilliant scientists in the whole world collected in one organization, 85% of them reject that there is a personal God. And you know what his response was? He said, that's not the story. He said, my question is, why is there 15% who believe in God? And that's what happens when we start doing things, solving problems, answering things for ourselves. We think that we can do anything, and we no longer need God. That is exactly what the whole lecture was about, by the way, is he went through all of these great scientists throughout history, and he said, at the point that they were ignorant, that's when they started believing in God. And his suggestion was, as we learn and we understand and we can explain how these things work, we don't need God anymore. That's what his whole argument was. And so, listen, that's a biblical argument. That's exactly what God's saying. As long as these people are able to do whatever they want to do and be successful, they're going to continue to ignore me. And they're not going to do what I've said. Nothing will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down there and confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad. Now, by the way, that doesn't mean that he picked them up and he dropped them in different places. What does that mean? That he created, through his providence, the situation to where people began to do exactly what he wanted them to do, which was to migrate. And so he confused their languages. And when you confuse language, what happens? There are misunderstandings. And when there are misunderstandings, what happens? People get their feelings hurt. When people get their feelings hurt, what happens? They don't want to be around those people anymore, so I go off and go somewhere else. By the way, that is the anatomy of a church split. Just covered it all. That's how it happens. And so he created the circumstances and confused their language so they no longer could communicate as freely, and that created the separation and caused them to migrate to all of these different places. And by the way, what does everyone believe? When they leave off and start their own place, what do they all believe? We're better than those people. So Babylon believed that they were the greatest city in the world, but then when the people left and started Nineveh, what did the people of Nineveh believe? That they built the best city. And what did the people over in Egypt believe when they built their city? That they built the best city. By the way, what did the Israelites believe when they built Jerusalem? That they built the best city. And we do the same thing still to this day. And so that's what's going on here. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the whole earth. How did we get people in every land? How do we get people speaking different languages? How do we get these nations? How do we get these ethnicities? God separated people. Now, what about skin color, hair texture, eye color, shapes, sizes, all those things? How does that come into play? I'm sorry? Genetics. And when you start pooling people together and limit the breeding to that group, what happens? They begin to look like one another. And the characteristics that are the predominant characteristics in that pool become the characteristics of the people. So it's not magic. It's the same way we get black cows and white cows and brown cows. It's the same way where we can get a German Shepherd and we can get a bulldog. We decide we want these particular traits. We find dogs that have those traits. We breed them together until we create one that has all the traits that we want. Then we breed it with other dogs that have the same traits until you finally get what we call a purebred line, because all of those descendants have those traits. That is exactly what happens in the human body as well. You know what's inside of every human, though? A spirit created in the image and likeness of God. We're all exactly the same spiritually. However, people lose sight of that. Why do they lose sight of that? Because we look different and we talk different and everybody thinks we're better than them. What do we call people that we run into that look different than us, that speak different than us, and that don't live exactly the way we do? What did the Europeans that came to North America say about the indigenous people that lived here? They were savages. What made them savages? They lived different than the Europeans. That's what the Europeans believed. I mean, look at that. And by the way, some of their technology was pretty impressive. You go into South America.
They were still in the Stone Age.
You go into South America, though, guess what? Long before we had Western medicine doing brain surgeries, you had people in South America doing brain surgeries. Long before it was being done in modern medicine. And people living through it. I don't know how they did it, what they did, but because someone's different doesn't mean they're dumb. The fact of the matter is we're all from the same three men. And that's a problem if we allow that to cause us to forget, which is why Paul went into Athens talking to those Greek folks who, by the way, thought that their city was the greatest city and their science was the greatest science and their knowledge was the greatest knowledge. And those Middle Easterners are kind of pesky. He walked in there and said, hey, I'm going to talk to you about the God who created all of this. The God who from one man made every nation of mankind to live on all the earth. That God who really isn't that far from us. Why? In him we live, we move, we have our being. We are all the offspring of God. He goes back to Genesis 1, and let us make man in our image and our likeness. He's not that far from us because we're all like him. And that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to bridge those gaps and trying to get these people to understand why they should care about the Hebrew God. Because he's saying he's not the Hebrew God. He's the God of creation. He's the God of all people. There is only one God. What did they believe? We read about this all throughout the Old Testament. Even the people of God from time to time lost sight of this. What did Jonah do when he jumped on the ship trying to sail away to Tarshish? What did he think? That maybe he was going to escape God. When he found himself in the bottom of the ocean and he cried out to God and God saved him by appointing this sea creature to swallow him up, swim up to shore and spit him out on the shore, what did he come to the realization of? You know what? It doesn't matter where you go, where you're at. God is there and God is all powerful. There is no way to escape God. And so at that point, he does something really interesting. He goes and does exactly what God asked him to do, even though he really didn't want God to do what he knew God was going to do. He knew that God was going to be forgiving, and he really didn't want those people to be forgiven. Yes, sir.
Just for a couple of moments, notice verse 6. I believe that's a kind of a divine commentary that applies to, has application for us today. Notice he says, God said this. God said that the people are one. Kind of interesting that Jesus prayed for unity. And he says here that they are are one. Paul implored the Christians that they all speak the same thing. It says here, the Lord said they all have one language. Jesus said, if you're one, then the world's going to believe that God has sent me. And if you all speak the same thing.
By the way, what did Peter say we should all speak?
As the oracles of God.
That's got to define our language.
But he says here, now nothing they propose to do will be withheld from them. So in this unity for their purpose, God was thwarting.
Right.
In the New Testament and the church, God calls us to be unified. But that same principle applies. We can do what God wants us to do because nothing we set ourselves to do will be
Right. And on top of that,
withheld.
nothing's impossible with God. So if we're doing His work and He is with us, if God is for us, who can be against us? Very quickly, this is a modern breakdown from anthropologists and other such scientists about how the migration of the world happened. You'll notice 1 and 2 are right here in the same part of the world we've been concentrating on. Ararat's right up in here. This is Saudi Arabia. This is Africa. These people filled out this continent. These people went up here through Europe. These people went this way. And then that's how they proposed that we got to the rest of the places. So it's really not all that different than what's described in Genesis 10. It's pretty amazing if you really think about it that they basically come up with the same migration pattern by looking at the stuff they dig out of the dirt. All right, got to stop.
Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing His mercy and His grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, He'll prepare for us a place. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be when we all see Jesus. We'll sing and shout the victory.